Sarah Martinez had always been different from the other girls in her small Texas town. While her classmates spent their afternoons at the mall or gossiping about boys, Sarah could be found in her grandfather's garage, learning to fix engines and listening to his war stories. Her grandfather, Miguel Martinez, was a decorated World War II veteran who had served in the Pacific Theater, and his tales of courage and sacrifice had shaped Sarah's worldview from an early age. The summer of 2018 marked a turning point in Sarah's life. She had just graduated from high school and was preparing to leave for college in the fall. Her grandfather's health had been declining for months, and the doctors had delivered the devastating news that his time was limited. Miguel had been fighting lung cancer, a cruel reminder of the chemicals he had been exposed to during his military service decades earlier. On a particularly hot July afternoon, Sarah sat beside her grandfather's hospital bed, holding his weathered hand. The old man's eyes, once bright with mischief and wisdom, had grown dim, but they still sparkled when he looked at his beloved granddaughter. Miguel had been more than a grandfather to Sarah. He had been her mentor, her hero, and her closest friend after her father had abandoned the family when she was just 7 years old. "Mija," Miguel whispered, his voice barely audible above the hum of the medical equipment. "I want you to promise me something." Sarah leaned closer, tears threatening to spill from her eyes. "Anything, Grandpa, you know that." Miguel's fingers tightened around hers with surprising strength. "Promise me you'll never forget where you come from. Promise me you'll remember the stories I've told you about the men who didn't make it home. They sacrificed everything so that you could have a future." Sarah nodded, unable to speak as emotion overwhelmed her. Her grandfather had told her countless stories about his fellow soldiers, men who had fallen in battles across distant islands in the Pacific. He had carried their memory with him for over 70 years, honoring their sacrifice through his words and his actions. 2 weeks later, Miguel Martinez passed away peacefully in his sleep. Sarah was devastated, but she was determined to honor his memory in a way that would be both personal and permanent. After much thought and research, she decided to get a tattoo that would commemorate not only her grandfather, but also the fallen soldiers he had spoken about so reverently. Sarah spent months designing the tattoo with a local artist named Danny Rodriguez, who had a reputation for creating meaningful military tributes. The design was intricate and deeply symbolic. At the center was a detailed portrait of her grandfather in his World War II uniform, surrounded by dog tags bearing the names of the soldiers he had told her about. Below the portrait were the coordinates of Iwo Jima, where Miguel had seen some of the fiercest fighting of the war. The entire piece was framed by American flag elements and military insignia that held special meaning to their family. The tattoo covered most of Sarah's left arm, from her shoulder to her elbow. It was a significant commitment, both financially and personally, but Sarah knew it was the right way to honor her grandfather's memory. When the tattoo was completed in November 2018, she felt a sense of closure and connection to her grandfather that she hadn't experienced since his passing. However, the reaction from her community was far from what she had expected. In the conservative small town where she had grown up, tattoos were still viewed with suspicion, especially on young women. Sarah's decision to get such a large and visible tattoo sparked controversy and gossip throughout the community. At the local diner where Sarah worked part-time to help support her mother, customers would stare and whisper when she served their coffee. Some made cruel comments within earshot, questioning her judgment and character. Mrs. Henderson, one of the town's most influential residents, had loudly proclaimed at the grocery store that Sarah had disrespected her grandfather's memory with that trashy display. The criticism was particularly painful, coming from people who had known and respected Miguel Martinez during his lifetime. Many of these same individuals had attended his funeral and had spoken highly of his service and character. Yet they couldn't understand or appreciate his granddaughter's tribute to him. Sarah's mother, Elena, tried to be supportive, but even she harbored some reservations about her daughter's decision. "I understand why you did it, Mija," Elena would say, "but people in this town don't understand. They see a girl with tattoos and they make assumptions." The judgment extended beyond just idle gossip. When Sarah applied for a job at the local bank, she was told that their dress code wouldn't accommodate her body art. The owner of a clothing boutique where Sarah had hoped to work made it clear that her appearance wouldn't be suitable for their clientele. Even at church, where the Martinez family had been faithful members for generations, Sarah noticed the uncomfortable stares and the way conversation stopped when she entered a room. The situation reached its peak during a town council meeting in December 2018. The meeting was supposed to be about the annual Christmas festival, but somehow the conversation turned to the town's image and the behavior of its young people. Councilman Robert Hayes, a pompous man who had never served in the military but considered himself a patriot, made several pointed comments about young people today who didn't respect traditional values. "We have young ladies in this town walking around with their arms covered in tattoos," Hayes declared, his voice dripping with disdain. "In my day, a young woman would never deface herself in such a manner. It shows a complete lack of respect for themselves and their families." Sarah had attended the meeting with her mother, hoping to volunteer for the festival planning committee. She felt her face burn with embarrassment and anger as Hayes continued his tirade, knowing that everyone in the room understood exactly who he was talking about. The worst part was that several people nodded in agreement, including some who had known her grandfather personally. After the meeting, Sarah sat in her car in the parking lot, fighting back tears. She pulled out her phone and looked at a photo of her and her grandfather taken just a few months before his death. In the picture, he was smiling proudly as he showed her his old military medals. She remembered how he had told her that the opinions of small-minded people didn't matter, that what mattered was staying true to your values and honoring the memory of those who had sacrificed for freedom. The harassment continued into the new year. At the local gym where Sarah had a membership, she overheard two older women discussing her tattoo in the locker room. One of them, Mrs. Patterson, was particularly cruel in her assessment. "It's such a shame," Mrs. Patterson said, not bothering to lower her voice. "Miguel was such a distinguished man, a real war hero. He must be rolling over in his grave seeing what his granddaughter has done to herself. That tattoo makes her look like she belongs in jail, not representing his memory." Her companion agreed enthusiastically. "I heard she can't even get a decent job now because of it." "Good riddance, I say. Maybe other young girls will learn from her mistake." Sarah pretended not to hear, but their words cut deep. She had gotten the tattoo to honor her grandfather, not to make a fashion statement or to rebel against society. The fact that people who had claimed to respect Miguel couldn't understand her tribute to him was heartbreaking. The judgment affected every aspect of Sarah's life. When she started college in January 2019, she found herself constantly wearing long-sleeved shirts to cover the tattoo, even in the sweltering Texas heat. She was tired of the stares, the whispered comments, and the assumptions people made about her character based solely on her appearance. Her college roommate Ashley was one of the first people to react positively to the tattoo. When Sarah finally felt comfortable enough to show it, Ashley was amazed by the artistry and the meaning behind it. "This is incredible," Ashley said, examining the detailed portrait of Miguel in his uniform. "You can see the love and respect in every line. Anyone who sees this and doesn't understand what it means isn't worth your time." Ashley's words gave Sarah some comfort, but she still struggled with the reaction from her hometown community. Every weekend when she returned home to help her mother with expenses and household duties, she faced the same judgmental stares and whispered comments. The situation took an unexpected turn during spring break. 2019, Sarah was working an extra shift at the diner to help her mother pay for some unexpected car repairs. It was a particularly busy Saturday morning, and the restaurant was filled with locals catching up on gossip over coffee and breakfast. Among the customers that morning was a group of men Sarah didn't recognize. They appeared to be travelers, possibly passing through town on their way to somewhere else. The men were quietly eating their breakfast when Officer Jenkins, one of the local police officers, approached their table. "You gentlemen aren't from around here," Jenkins said in a tone that was more statement than question. "Mind telling me what brings you to our town?" The leader of the group, a tall man with graying hair and intense eyes, looked up calmly. "Just passing through, officer. We're on our way to a memorial service in Austin." Jenkins nodded but continued to hover near their table, clearly suspicious of the strangers. Sarah couldn't help but notice how the other customers in the diner were stealing glances at the men, whispering among themselves about the newcomers. As Sarah refilled their coffee cups, she couldn't help but notice something familiar about one of the men. There was something in his bearing, in the way he carried himself, that reminded her of her grandfather. It was a quality she had learned to recognize in veterans, a certain alertness and dignity that came from military service. When she brought their check, the older man looked up at her with a kind smile. "Thank you for the excellent service, miss. This is a nice town you have here." Sarah smiled back, but before she could respond, Mrs. Henderson chose that moment to make one of her loudly whispered comments to her breakfast companion. "That's the girl I was telling you about, Martha, the one with the terrible tattoo on her arm. Such a shame what young people do to themselves these days. Her poor grandfather would be so ashamed." Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. She had been so focused on providing good service to the strangers that she had forgotten to keep her tattoo covered. The long-sleeved shirt she had been wearing had gotten wet while cleaning tables, so she had rolled up her sleeves without thinking. The older man at the table noticed Sarah's discomfort and glanced in the direction of Mrs. Henderson's voice. His expression remained neutral, but Sarah noticed a slight tightening around his eyes, as if he was processing what he had heard. "Don't mind them," Sarah said quietly as she placed the check on their table. "Some people in this town don't approve of tattoos, especially on young women." The man studied her face for a moment, then looked down at her exposed tattoo. His expression changed dramatically when he saw the detailed portrait of Miguel in his World War II uniform, surrounded by the dog tags and military symbols. "May I ask about your tattoo?" he said, his voice gentle but intense. "That appears to be a military tribute." Sarah nodded, suddenly feeling defensive. She had grown so accustomed to negative reactions that she automatically prepared herself for criticism. "It's a memorial to my grandfather," she explained quickly. "He served in World War II in the Pacific Theater. He passed away last year, and I wanted to honor his memory and the men who didn't come home with him." The older man continued to study the tattoo, his eyes moving over every detail, with what appeared to be recognition and respect. The other men at his table had also noticed the tattoo and were looking at it with similar expressions. "Your grandfather," the older man said slowly. "What was his name?" "Miguel Martinez," Sarah replied, wondering why this stranger seemed so interested. "He was with the 5th Marine Division at Iwo Jima." The reaction from the men was immediate and profound. The older man's eyes widened with what appeared to be recognition, and he exchanged meaningful glances with his companions. The atmosphere at their table had changed completely, charged with an emotion that Sarah couldn't quite identify. "Miguel Martinez," the man repeated, his voice filled with something that sounded like awe. "Sergeant Miguel Martinez from Corpus Christi?" Sarah's heart began to race. "Yes, that's right. How did you know that?" The older man stood up slowly, his companions following his lead. The entire diner seemed to sense that something significant was happening, and conversations began to quiet as people turned to watch the unfolding scene. What happened next would change Sarah's life forever and transform how her entire community viewed both her and her tribute to her grandfather's memory. The stranger's response would reveal a connection that neither Sarah nor anyone else in the diner could have anticipated, setting in motion a series of events that would finally give her the recognition and respect she had always deserved. The older man's eyes remained fixed on Sarah's tattoo as he processed what she had told him. The silence in the diner had become almost palpable, with every customer straining to hear what would happen next. Even Mrs. Henderson had stopped her criticism mid-sentence, sensing that something important was unfolding at the stranger's table. "Sergeant Miguel Martinez," the man repeated again, his voice carrying a weight of memory and emotion. "I knew your grandfather, young lady. I knew him very well." Sarah felt her knees go weak. She had to grip the edge of the table to steady herself as the implications of his words sank in. "You knew my grandfather? But how? When?" The older man extended his hand to her with formal precision. "Commander James Sullivan, United States Navy SEALs, retired. I had the honor of serving with your grandfather during a joint operation in the Pacific in 1945, just before the end of the war." The entire diner fell silent. Even the kitchen staff had stopped their work to listen to this unexpected revelation. Sarah shook Commander Sullivan's hand, her mind reeling with questions and emotions. "Your grandfather saved my life," Sullivan continued, his voice carrying across the now silent restaurant. and the lives of 3 other men in my unit. We were trapped behind enemy lines on a small island north of Okinawa. Your grandfather and his Marines came looking for us when we missed our extraction point. Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. Her grandfather had told her many stories about the war, but he had never mentioned anything about saving Navy SEALs. Like many veterans, Miguel had been modest about his own heroism, focusing instead on the sacrifices of the men who hadn't made it home. Commander Sullivan gestured to his companions. These men are also veterans, and we were on our way to honor fallen comrades at a memorial service in Austin. But this meeting is no coincidence. Your grandfather's name is engraved on a memorial wall there, recognizing his heroism during that rescue mission. One of the other men, a stocky gentleman with kind eyes, stepped forward. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Morrison, Army Rangers, retired. Commander Sullivan has told that story about Sergeant Martinez more times than I can count. Your grandfather was a legend among the men who served with him. The third man nodded in agreement. Master Sergeant David Chen, Marine Corps, retired. The story of that rescue is part of our unit's history. Sergeant Martinez led his men through enemy territory for 6 hours to reach Sullivan's team. They were outnumbered 3-1, but they never hesitated. Sarah was overwhelmed by this flood of information about her grandfather's wartime service. She had always known he was a hero, but she had never realized the extent of his actions or how his bravery had been remembered by other servicemen. Commander Sullivan studied her tattoo again, pointing to specific details. These dog tags, the names on them. I recognize several of these men. They were Marines who served with your grandfather. And these coordinates, they're not just for Iwo Jima, are they? Sarah shook her head, wiping away tears. No, sir. They're the exact coordinates where my grandfather said some of his closest friends fell in battle. He carried their memory with him for his entire life. And now you're carrying it forward, Sullivan said with deep respect. This tattoo isn't just artwork. It's a memorial, a history lesson, and a tribute all in one. Anyone who sees this and doesn't understand its significance is missing something profound. The commander's voice had grown stronger and more authoritative as he spoke, carrying easily throughout the small diner. Every person in the restaurant was now openly listening, their breakfast forgotten as they witnessed this extraordinary encounter. Mrs. Henderson, who had been so quick to criticize Sarah's tattoo just minutes earlier, looked uncomfortable and ashamed. Her companion Martha was staring at the scene with wide eyes, clearly understanding that her friend had been terribly wrong in her judgment. Officer Jenkins, who had been suspicious of the strangers, now stood at attention near their table, his entire demeanor changed by the revelation of their military status and connection to Sarah's grandfather. Commander Sullivan turned his attention to the broader audience in the diner. I couldn't help but overhear some comments about this young woman's tattoo when we came in. I want everyone in this room to understand something very clearly. His voice took on the commanding tone of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. This tattoo represents more honor, sacrifice, and patriotism than most people will ever understand. Sarah Martinez has chosen to carry forward the memory of heroes who gave their lives for this country. She has done so with artistry, with respect, and with a depth of meaning that should make every American proud. The silence in the diner was now complete. Even the coffee machine seemed to have stopped its burbling. Commander Sullivan's words carried the weight of absolute authority, and no one dared to challenge or question them. Her grandfather, Sergeant Miguel Martinez, was awarded the Bronze Star with V for Valor for his actions during the war. He was recommended for the Silver Star, but the paperwork was lost in the chaos of the war's end. The men he saved went on to serve their country for decades afterward. I personally served for 35 years in the Navy SEALs, rising to command multiple units and operations. None of that would have been possible if Sergeant Martinez hadn't risked his own life to save mine. Sullivan paused, allowing his words to sink in before continuing. This young woman has honored her grandfather's memory in the most appropriate and meaningful way possible. Anyone who sees this tattoo and thinks it represents anything other than the highest form of respect and remembrance is demonstrating their own ignorance, not hers. Sarah felt as if she were in a dream. After months of enduring criticism and judgment from her community, she was finally hearing someone defend not only her tattoo, but the deep meaning behind it. The validation from Commander Sullivan and his companions meant more to her than she could express. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison stepped forward to add his perspective. In my 40 years of military service, I've seen many ways that families honor their fallen heroes. Memorial services, flag presentations, grave decorations, scholarship funds, but I've never seen anything as personal and permanent as what Sarah has done. She carries her grandfather's memory and the memory of his fallen comrades with her wherever she goes. That's not disrespectful. That's devotion. Master Sergeant Chen nodded in agreement. In the Marine Corps, we have a saying, Semper Fidelis, always faithful. Sarah has demonstrated that faithfulness to her grandfather and to the Marines who didn't come home. Her tattoo is a living memorial that will honor their sacrifice for the rest of her life. The impact of these testimonials on the diner's customers was immediate and visible. Mrs. Henderson looked mortified, clearly realizing how wrong she had been in her harsh judgment. Other customers who had previously stared or whispered about Sarah's tattoo now looked at her with new respect and understanding. Officer Jenkins approached the group and addressed Commander Sullivan directly. "Sir, I want to apologize for my earlier suspicion. I should have recognized fellow servicemen immediately." Sullivan smiled and clapped the young officer on the shoulder. "No need to apologize, son. You were doing your job, looking out for your community. That's exactly what you should be doing." The commander then turned back to Sarah, his expression becoming more personal and gentle. "Your grandfather spoke about you often during those long nights when we were recovering from that mission. He showed us a picture of a little girl in pigtails who he said was going to change the world someday. He was so proud of you even then." Sarah's tears flowed freely now. "He never told me he had met other servicemen who remembered him. He was always so modest about what he did during the war." "That's because he was a true hero," Sullivan replied. "Real heroes don't boast about their actions. They carry their experiences quietly and focus on making sure the sacrifices of their fallen comrades aren't forgotten. From what I can see, he passed that sense of honor and responsibility on to you." The conversation continued for another hour, with the three veterans sharing stories about Miguel Martinez and his wartime service. Sarah learned details about her grandfather's military career that he had never shared with his family, including several other instances of heroism and leadership. Commander Sullivan explained how the rescue mission had unfolded. His SEAL team had been conducting reconnaissance behind enemy lines when they were discovered by a Japanese patrol. In the ensuing firefight, 2 of his men had been wounded, and they had been forced to take shelter in a cave system that was quickly surrounded by enemy forces. "We were running out of ammunition and medical supplies," Sullivan recalled. "Our radio had been damaged in the initial contact, so we couldn't call for extraction. We figured we were going to die in those caves." Lieutenant Colonel Morrison picked up the story. "That's when Sergeant Martinez volunteered to lead a rescue mission. Command told him it was too dangerous, that the area was too heavily fortified. But your grandfather insisted that no American serviceman would be left behind on his watch. He led 12 Marines through 6 miles of jungle, avoiding enemy patrols and setting up diversionary attacks to draw attention away from our position," Master Sergeant Chen continued. "When they finally reached us, your grandfather personally carried one of the wounded SEALs on his back for 3 miles to the extraction point." Sarah listened in amazement as these men painted a picture of her grandfather as a genuine war hero whose actions had saved multiple lives and changed the course of several military careers. She had always known Miguel was special, but she was only now beginning to understand the full extent of his heroism. The veterans also explained the significance of several elements in Sarah's tattoo that she hadn't fully understood when she designed it. The specific military insignia, the positioning of the dog tags, and even the style of the uniform portrait, all held deep meaning within military tradition. Whoever designed this tattoo understood military history and protocol, Commander Sullivan observed. Every detail is accurate and appropriate. This isn't just a pretty picture, it's a historically correct tribute that follows proper military memorial traditions. As the morning wore on, word of what was happening at the diner began to spread throughout the small town. People started arriving just to witness the extraordinary scene of these distinguished veterans honoring Sarah and her grandfather's memory. Among the new arrivals was Mayor Patricia Gonzalez, who had heard about the situation from her secretary. The mayor, a middle-aged woman who had always tried to be fair and progressive in her leadership, immediately grasped the significance of what was happening. "Commander Sullivan," she said, approaching the group with obvious respect. "I'm Mayor Gonzalez. I want to apologize on behalf of our community for any disrespect that Sarah has experienced. We clearly didn't understand the true meaning of her tribute to her grandfather." Sullivan accepted the mayor's apology graciously, but his focus remained on ensuring that Sarah received the recognition and respect she deserved. "Mayor, this young woman has honored not just her grandfather, but all the men who served and died with him. She deserves to be celebrated, not criticized." The mayor nodded emphatically. "You're absolutely right, Commander. I'd like to invite you and your companions to be guests of honor at our next town council meeting. I think our community needs to hear these stories and understand the true meaning of Sarah's tribute." As the day continued, the atmosphere in the diner, and by extension the entire town, began to shift dramatically. People who had previously judged Sarah harshly were now approaching her with apologies and newfound respect. The validation from Commander Sullivan and his fellow veterans had completely changed the community's perception of both Sarah and her meaningful tattoo. But the day's revelations were far from over. Commander Sullivan had one more surprise that would elevate Sarah's story from a local tale of misunderstanding to something much more significant and far-reaching. As the afternoon progressed, more people continued to arrive at the diner, drawn by word of mouth about the remarkable encounter taking place. The small restaurant had become an impromptu gathering place for the entire community, with people standing in groups outside the windows, all trying to catch a glimpse of the distinguished veterans who were honoring Sarah and her grandfather's memory. Commander Sullivan had been speaking quietly with his companions, occasionally glancing at Sarah's tattoo and making notes in a small leather journal he had pulled from his jacket pocket. There was an intensity in their discussion that suggested something significant was being planned. Sarah noticed their serious conversation and wondered what they might be discussing. She had been so overwhelmed by the day's events that she was still struggling to process everything she had learned about her grandfather's wartime service. The revelation that Miguel had saved the lives of these men had given her a new understanding of the man who had raised her and shaped her values. Mayor Gonzalez had remained at the diner, using the opportunity to speak with community members about the misunderstanding that had occurred regarding Sarah's tattoo. She was clearly embarrassed by how some residents had treated the young woman and was determined to make amends. "I want everyone to understand," the mayor said to a group of gathered townspeople, "that we made a serious error in judgment. Sarah Martinez has done something beautiful and meaningful to honor her grandfather and his fellow veterans. We should be proud to have someone in our community who values service and sacrifice so deeply." Mrs. Hassies. Henderson, who had been one of Sarah's harshest critics, approached the young woman with obvious shame and discomfort. The elderly woman's hands shook slightly as she reached out to touch Sarah's arm. "My dear," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice quavering with emotion, "I owe you a tremendous apology. I said terrible things about you and your tattoo, and I was completely wrong. I hope you can forgive a foolish old woman who spoke without understanding." Sarah was gracious in her acceptance of the apology, though the months of criticism and judgment had left their mark. "Henderson, I understand why people might not have understood at first glance, but I hoped that people who knew my grandfather would trust that I would never do anything to dishonor his memory." The elderly woman nodded, tears visible in her eyes. "Miguel was such a good man, and he loved you so much. He would talk about you constantly, how proud he was of your kindness, your intelligence, your strength. I should have known that anything you did to remember him would be done with love and respect." Officer Jenkins had also approached to offer his own apology. The young policeman was clearly moved by what he had witnessed and learned during the day. "Sarah, I want you to know that I've learned something important today," Jenkins said sincerely. "I've been too quick to judge people based on appearances instead of taking the time to understand their stories. Your grandfather would be proud of how you've honored him, and I'm proud to serve a community that has someone like you in it." As these conversations continued around the diner, Commander Sullivan finished his discussion with his fellow veterans and stood up to address the gathered crowd. The authority in his bearing immediately commanded attention, and the room fell silent as people turned to hear what he had to say. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sullivan began, his voice carrying the same commanding presence that had served him during decades of military leadership. "I want to share something with all of you that goes beyond today's remarkable encounter." He paused, allowing his words to sink in before continuing. Earlier this year, the Department of Defense launched a new initiative to recognize and document the stories of World War II veterans whose heroic actions may have been overlooked or inadequately recorded due to the chaos of wartime record-keeping. Sarah felt her heart begin to race. She sensed that whatever Commander Sullivan was about to reveal would be significant, not just for her but potentially for her grandfather's legacy. As part of this initiative, Sullivan continued, "I've been working with a team of military historians to document the rescue mission that Sergeant Miguel Martinez led to save my SEAL team. We've been gathering testimonies, reviewing classified documents that have recently been declassified, and building a comprehensive record of your grandfather's heroism." The commander reached into his jacket and pulled out an official-looking folder. "3 weeks ago, based on our documentation and the testimonies of surviving servicemen, the Department of Defense approved a posthumous upgrade of your grandfather's Bronze Star to the Silver Star, which was the original recommendation that had been lost in 1945. Gasps of amazement and excitement rippled through the crowd. Sarah felt as if the world had stopped spinning. Her grandfather was going to receive the Silver Star, one of the military's highest honors for valor in combat. Furthermore, Sullivan continued, his voice growing even more formal and ceremonial, "The Secretary of the Navy has approved a special recognition ceremony to be held here in your hometown, honoring not just Sergeant Martinez, but all the local veterans who served with distinction during World War II." Mayor Gonzalez stepped forward, her face beaming with pride and excitement. "Commander Sullivan, our community would be honored to host such a ceremony. We'll do everything possible to make it a fitting tribute to these heroes." Sullivan nodded approvingly. "The ceremony is scheduled for Memorial Day weekend, just 6 weeks from today. We'll have representatives from all branches of the military, including active duty personnel, and veterans from across the state. It will be a significant event, and Sarah will be recognized as the keeper of her grandfather's legacy." The impact of this announcement on the assembled crowd was immediate and profound. People who had criticized Sarah just hours earlier were now looking at her with awe and respect. The young woman who had been ostracized for her tattoo was now being recognized as the granddaughter of a genuine American hero. But Commander Sullivan wasn't finished. He had one more surprise that would create a moment none of the witnesses would ever forget. "There's something else," Sullivan said, his voice becoming more personal and emotional. "In military tradition, when we encounter someone who carries the memory of fallen heroes, we have a way of showing our respect and recognition." The commander looked directly at Sarah, his expression serious and formal. "Sarah Martinez, your tattoo represents more than just artwork or even a personal memorial. It represents a sacred trust, a commitment to ensure that the sacrifices of brave men are never forgotten. You have taken on the responsibility of being a living memorial to your grandfather and his fallen comrades." Sullivan stepped closer to Sarah, and his 2 companions moved to flank him in a formal military formation. The entire diner fell completely silent, sensing that something ceremonial and significant was about to occur. "In recognition of your dedication to preserving the memory of Sergeant Miguel Martinez and the Marines who served with him," Sullivan announced in a voice that carried throughout the restaurant and beyond to the crowd gathered outside, "and in acknowledgement of the sacred trust you have accepted through your memorial tattoo, I render this salute on behalf of all the men whose lives were saved by your grandfather's heroism." What happened next would become the defining moment of Sarah's life, and a story that would be told and retold throughout the community for generations to come. Commander Sullivan, followed immediately by Lieutenant Colonel Morrison and Master Sergeant Chen, came to rigid attention and rendered a perfect military salute to Sarah Martinez. The salute wasn't casual or informal. It was the full, ceremonial salute reserved for honoring the highest military traditions and the most sacred memories. The silence in the diner was absolute. No one moved. No one spoke. No one even seemed to breathe, as these distinguished veterans held their salute for a full 30 seconds. The gesture was so powerful, so unexpected, and so profoundly meaningful that several people in the crowd began to cry. Sarah stood frozen, overwhelmed by the honor being shown to her, and, through her, to her grandfather's memory. She had never imagined that her tattoo would lead to such recognition, such validation of the love and respect she had tried to express through her tribute. When the three veterans finally lowered their salutes, the silence continued for several more seconds before someone in the crowd began to applaud. The applause grew and spread until everyone in the diner and the crowd outside was clapping, many with tears streaming down their faces. Officer Jenkins, acting on instinct and emotion, stepped forward and rendered his own salute to Sarah. Within moments, Mayor Gonzalez had placed her hand over her heart in the civilian equivalent of the military salute, and others in the crowd were following suit. What had begun as a simple breakfast at a small-town diner had transformed into an impromptu ceremony honoring not just Sarah's grandfather, but all the veterans who had served their country with courage and distinction. Mrs. Henderson pushed through the crowd to reach Sarah, her elderly face streaked with tears. "My dear girl," she said, her voice choked with emotion, "I am so ashamed of how I treated you. You are a hero in your own right for keeping your grandfather's memory alive. Can you ever forgive me?" Sarah embraced the elderly woman, her own tears flowing freely. "Mrs. Henderson, there's nothing to forgive. I understand that people didn't know the whole story. That's why today is so important. Now everyone knows." Commander Sullivan approached Sarah one final time before he and his companions prepared to continue their journey to Austin. "Sarah, I want you to know that what happened here today wasn't planned or orchestrated. This was simply the natural response when good people learn the truth and recognize real honor when they see it." He handed her his business card and the official folder containing information about her grandfather's Silver Star upgrade. "I'll be in touch about the Memorial Day ceremony. And Sarah, you've honored his memory in the most meaningful way possible, and now his story will be told for generations to come." As the three veterans prepared to leave, the crowd parted to create a clear path to the door. People continued to applaud, and many called out their thanks and respect to both the visiting veterans and to Sarah. Just before reaching the door, Commander Sullivan turned back to address the crowd one final time. "I want everyone here to remember this day and this lesson. True honor isn't always immediately recognized or understood. Sometimes it takes time for people to see past surface appearances, to recognize the deeper meaning and value of someone's actions. Sarah Martinez showed us all what real honor looks like, not seeking attention or praise, but quietly and permanently carrying forward the memory of those who sacrificed for our freedom." With that, the three veterans left the diner, but their impact on Sarah and the entire community would last far beyond their brief visit. The young woman who had been criticized and ostracized for her tattoo was now being celebrated as a keeper of military tradition and a living memorial to American heroism. The transformation was complete, but the story was far from over. The upcoming Memorial Day ceremony would bring even more recognition and validation, cementing Sarah's place in her community and inspiring others to think more deeply about the ways we honor those who have served and sacrificed for our country. The weeks following Commander Sullivan's visit transformed Sarah's life in ways she never could have anticipated. The story of the three veterans saluting her tattoo spread rapidly throughout Texas and beyond, carried by social media, local news outlets, and word of mouth from the many witnesses who had been present at the diner that remarkable Saturday morning. It's about history. Sarah's phone began ringing constantly with interview requests from newspapers, television stations, and even national media outlets. The story resonated with people across the country who were moved by the tale of a young woman honoring her grandfather's memory and the ultimate validation she received from fellow veterans. The Today Show wanted her to appear as a guest. People magazine requested a photo shoot. The Military Channel expressed interest in featuring her story in a documentary about World War II veterans and their families. Sarah was overwhelmed by the attention, but she remained focused on the most important upcoming event, the Memorial Day ceremony that would honor her grandfather and other local veterans. Mayor Gonzalez had thrown herself into organizing what was shaping up to be the most significant event in the town's recent history. The ceremony had grown far beyond what anyone had originally envisioned, with confirmed attendance from high-ranking military officials, veteran organizations from across the state, and hundreds of people who had been touched by Sarah's story. "This is going to be bigger than our annual county fair," the mayor told Sarah during one of their planning meetings. We're expecting over 2,000 people, including a delegation from the Pentagon and representatives from all 5 branches of the military. The town had rallied around the event with unprecedented enthusiasm and support. Local businesses donated money and services. Volunteers worked tirelessly on decorations and logistics, and the high school marching band prepared special patriotic performances. Even Mrs. Henderson, who had become one of Sarah's most ardent supporters since her dramatic change of heart, organized a committee of elderly ladies to prepare food and refreshments for the visiting veterans and their families. Sarah's mother, Elena, was amazed by the transformation in how the community viewed her daughter. "Mija," she said one evening as they prepared dinner together, "your grandfather always said that the truth has a way of coming to light eventually. He would be so proud of how you've honored his memory and how the whole community has come together to celebrate him." The preparations weren't limited to the ceremony itself. A local contractor had volunteered to build a permanent memorial in the town square, featuring a bronze plaque with Miguel Martinez's name and a description of his heroic actions during the war. The memorial would also include the names of other local veterans who had served with distinction, creating a lasting tribute to the town's military heritage. Danny Rodriguez, the tattoo artist who had created Sarah's memorial tattoo, found himself suddenly in demand from people wanting their own military tribute tattoos. But Danny was selective about the work he accepted, insisting that each piece have genuine meaning and personal connection to military service. What Sarah did with her grandfather's memorial opened people's eyes to the artistic and emotional possibilities of tattoo work. Danny explained to a reporter from a tattoo industry magazine, "But I won't do military tribute work unless the client has a real connection to the service member they want to honor. It has to be authentic and meaningful, like Sarah's tattoo." 3 weeks before the Memorial Day ceremony, Sarah received a phone call that added another layer of significance to the upcoming event. The caller was Dr. Rebecca Washington, a military historian from the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. "Miss Martinez," Dr. Washington said, "I've been following your story with great interest. Our museum would like to create a permanent exhibit featuring your grandfather's story and your tribute to him. We believe it represents an important example of how families preserve and honor military history." Sarah was stunned by the request. "You want to put my grandfather's story in a national museum?" "Absolutely," Dr. Washington replied. "His rescue of Commander Sullivan's SEAL team is an important piece of World War II history that hasn't been widely documented. Your tattoo and the way you've preserved his memory represent exactly the kind of family legacy preservation we want to highlight in our exhibits." The museum was requesting photographs of Miguel's military documents, his medals, the tattoo design process, and interviews with Sarah about her grandfather's influence on her life. They also wanted to document the upcoming Memorial Day ceremony as part of the exhibit. As the ceremony date approached, Sarah found herself dealing with emotions she hadn't expected. The validation and recognition were wonderful, but she also felt the weight of responsibility that came with representing her grandfather's legacy on such a public stage. Her college roommate Ashley came home with her for the ceremony, providing much-needed emotional support during the intense preparation period. Ashley was amazed by the transformation in how Sarah was treated by the community. "It's like you're living in a completely different town," Ashley observed as they walked through the town square, where people constantly stopped to greet Sarah with warmth and respect. "These are the same people who were giving you dirty looks just 2 months ago?" Sarah nodded, still somewhat bewildered by the dramatic change. "It's hard to believe sometimes. But I think Commander Sullivan was right when he said that people needed to understand the whole story before they could appreciate what the tattoo really meant." The night before the ceremony, Sarah had trouble sleeping. She stood in her backyard, looking up at the stars and thinking about her grandfather. She could almost hear his voice, gentle and reassuring, telling her that she had done the right thing and that he was proud of her. The morning of the Memorial Day ceremony dawned clear and beautiful, with perfect weather for the outdoor event. Sarah woke early and spent extra time getting ready, knowing that this day would be photographed and remembered for years to come. She chose a simple but elegant dress that would showcase her tattoo appropriately, understanding that the memorial artwork on her arm would be a central focus of the ceremony. By 8 in the morning, people were already arriving in town for the 10 o'clock ceremony. The town square had been transformed into an impressive venue, with a raised platform for speakers, rows of chairs for honored guests, and patriotic decorations throughout the area. A large banner reading, "Honoring Sergeant Miguel Martinez and all who served," stretched across the main street. Commander Sullivan arrived an hour before the ceremony, accompanied by an even larger group of veterans than Sarah had expected. Along with Lieutenant Colonel Morrison and Master Sergeant Chen, he brought 12 other servicemen and women who had connections to Miguel's wartime service, or who had been inspired by Sarah's story. "Sarah," Commander Sullivan said as he greeted her before the ceremony, "I want you to meet some very special people who wanted to be here today." Among the group was Colonel Patricia Adams, a Marine Corps officer whose father had served in Miguel's unit during the Pacific Campaign. There was also Sergeant Major Robert Kim, whose grandfather had been one of the Marines whose names appeared on Sarah's tattoo. "Miss Martinez," Sergeant Major Kim said with deep emotion, "seeing my grandfather's name on your arm, knowing that his memory is being preserved and honored by someone of your generation, means more to my family than you can imagine." As the ceremony time approached, the crowd continued to grow. The original estimate of 2,000 attendees proved to be conservative, as over 3,000 people ultimately gathered in and around the town square. The crowd included military personnel in dress uniforms, veterans wearing their service medals, families of servicemen and women, and civilians who had been moved by Sarah's story. The ceremony began with the presentation of colors by the high school ROTC unit, followed by the national anthem performed by the school choir. Mayor Gonzalez served as the master of ceremonies, welcoming the crowd and explaining the significance of the day. 6 weeks ago, the mayor began, "Our community learned an important lesson about the danger of judging people without understanding their stories. Today, we celebrate not just the heroism of Sergeant Miguel Martinez, but also the dedication of his granddaughter Sarah, who has ensured that his sacrifice and the sacrifices of his fellow Marines will never be forgotten." The program included speeches from several military officials, including a brigadier general who had flown in from San Antonio specifically for the ceremony. Each speaker emphasized the importance of preserving military history and honoring the sacrifices of veterans and their families. But the most moving moment came when Commander Sullivan took the podium to present Miguel Martinez's posthumous Silver Star to Sarah. The medal had been specially prepared for the ceremony, with an engraved citation detailing the rescue mission that had earned Miguel the upgraded decoration. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sullivan announced, his voice carrying clearly across the packed square, "it is my tremendous honor to present this Silver Star, on behalf of the Secretary of the Navy and the Department of Defense, to the family of Sergeant Miguel Martinez, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action, while serving with the 5th Marine Division in the Pacific Theater during World War II. As Sullivan read the full citation describing Miguel's heroic rescue of the trapped SEAL team, Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. The formal military language couldn't fully capture her grandfather's courage and selflessness, but it provided official recognition of his extraordinary service. When Sullivan presented the medal to Sarah, she accepted it with trembling hands, overwhelmed by the honor being bestowed on her grandfather's memory. The crowd erupted in sustained applause that lasted for several minutes, but the ceremony's most powerful moment was yet to come. Commander Sullivan had arranged for a surprise that would create an indelible memory for everyone present. "Before we conclude today's ceremony," Sullivan announced, "I want to ask all the veterans in attendance to please stand and join me in a final tribute to Sergeant Martinez and all our fallen comrades." As the veterans throughout the crowd rose to their feet, Sarah realized what was about to happen. Her heart began to race as she understood that she was about to witness something extraordinary. "Sarah Martinez," Commander Sullivan called out in his commanding voice, "please step forward to receive the honors due to the keeper of Sergeant Miguel Martinez's legacy." Sarah moved to the center of the platform, facing the crowd of thousands. The sight before her was breathtaking. Hundreds of veterans in uniform and civilian clothes, standing at attention, their eyes fixed on her with expressions of deep respect and admiration. Commander Sullivan's voice rang out across the silent crowd. "Present arms." In perfect unison, every veteran in the crowd rendered a crisp military salute to Sarah Martinez. The sight of hundreds of servicemen and women simultaneously saluting the young woman with the memorial tattoo created a moment of such profound beauty and meaning that many spectators began to cry. The salute was held for a full minute, creating a tableau of respect and honor that photographers and videographers captured from every angle. The silence was complete, except for the sound of flags flapping in the gentle breeze and the quiet sobs of people moved by the overwhelming emotion of the moment. When the veterans finally lowered their salutes, the crowd exploded in the longest and loudest ovation in the town's history. The applause continued for over 5 minutes, with people standing, cheering, and wiping away tears as they celebrated Sarah and her grandfather's legacy. As the ceremony concluded and people began to mingle and share refreshments, Sarah found herself surrounded by veterans and their families, all wanting to thank her for preserving military history and honoring the sacrifices of servicemen and women. An elderly woman approached her with a photograph of a young Marine in World War II uniform. "This was my brother," the woman said through tears. "He died at Guadalcanal in 1942. Seeing how you've honored your grandfather gives me hope that someone will remember my brother's sacrifice too." Similar conversations continued throughout the afternoon, with person after person sharing their own family military stories and expressing gratitude for Sarah's example of how to honor and preserve veteran legacies. The day had transformed Sarah from a criticized young woman with a misunderstood tattoo into a recognized symbol of military family pride and historical preservation. But more importantly, it had given her the deepest possible validation that she had honored her grandfather's memory in exactly the way he would have wanted. 2 years after the Memorial Day ceremony that changed her life, Sarah Martinez stood before a packed auditorium at Texas A&M University, preparing to deliver the keynote address at the annual Veterans Day commemoration. The young woman who had once been criticized for her tattoo was now a nationally recognized advocate for veteran recognition and military family legacy preservation. The journey from that morning at the diner to this moment had been extraordinary in ways Sarah never could have imagined. The story of her grandfather's heroism and her tribute to his memory had resonated far beyond their small Texas town, inspiring similar recognition ceremonies across the country and sparking a national conversation about how families can best honor their military heritage. Sarah's tattoo, once a source of criticism and judgment, had become famous throughout the military community and beyond. The detailed portrait of Sergeant Miguel Martinez, surrounded by the names of his fallen comrades and the symbols of his service, had been featured in military publications, museum exhibits, and even congressional testimony about the importance of preserving World War II veteran stories. The National World War II Museum's exhibit featuring her grandfather's story had become one of their most popular displays, drawing visitors from around the world who wanted to learn about the rescue mission and see how one family had chosen to preserve the memory of wartime sacrifice. Dr. Pressid, Rebecca Washington had told Sarah that the exhibit had inspired hundreds of other families to share their own veteran stories with the museum. Sarah had completed her college degree in history, with a focus on military studies, writing her senior thesis on the importance of family storytelling in preserving veteran legacies. She had been accepted into graduate school at several prestigious universities, but she had chosen to stay in Texas to continue her work with veteran organizations and military families. Her relationship with her hometown had been completely transformed. The community that had once whispered about her tattoo now celebrated her as one of their most distinguished residents. The town square memorial honoring her grandfather and other local veterans had become a destination for military history enthusiasts and a source of pride for the entire community. Mrs. Henderson, now in her 80s, had become one of Sarah's closest friends and supporters. The elderly woman had dedicated her remaining years to helping other families research and document their military heritage, inspired by Sarah's example of honoring veteran sacrifice. "That girl taught me that wisdom doesn't always come with age," Mrs. Henderson often told people who asked about her transformation. "Sometimes the young people are the ones who understand honor and respect better than those of us who should know better." The tattoo artist Danny Rodriguez had built a thriving business creating meaningful military tribute tattoos, but he maintained strict standards about authenticity and personal connection. He had trained several other artists in the proper protocols for military memorial artwork, helping to establish new standards for respectful veteran tribute tattoos. Commander Sullivan had remained in close contact with Sarah, serving as an unofficial mentor as she navigated the various opportunities and responsibilities that came with her unexpected fame. He had nominated her for several national awards, recognizing her contributions to veteran advocacy and historical preservation. Sarah represents the best of what we hope to see from the younger generation, Sullivan had written in one of his nomination letters. She has taken the responsibility of preserving military history seriously, and she has used her platform to encourage others to honor their own family military legacies. The impact of Sarah's story had extended far beyond recognition and awards. She had received thousands of letters and emails from military families around the world, sharing their own stories of veteran relatives and asking for advice on how to preserve their memories appropriately. One letter that particularly moved her came from a young man in Ohio whose grandfather had served in Vietnam. The grandson had been considering getting a tattoo to honor his grandfather, but was worried about family disapproval. After reading about Sarah's experience, he had decided to move forward with his memorial tattoo, and his family had ultimately embraced his tribute to their veteran relative. Another correspondence came from a military wife whose husband had been killed in Afghanistan. She had been struggling with how to help her young children understand and remember their father's sacrifice. Sarah's story had inspired her to create a family memorial garden, with military symbols and her husband's favorite flowers, providing a peaceful place where the children could feel connected to their father's memory. These stories reminded Sarah daily that her grandfather's legacy had grown beyond their family, to inspire others to think more deeply about honoring military service and sacrifice. Miguel Martinez's name was now known by thousands of people who had never met him, but who understood his courage and dedication through his granddaughter's tribute. Sarah's public speaking engagements had taken her across the country, from small-town veteran organizations to major military installations, to congressional hearings on veteran affairs. She had testified before a House subcommittee about the importance of supporting programs that help families preserve military history and document veteran stories. At each appearance, Sarah made sure to emphasize that her story wasn't unique or special in terms of family love for a veteran grandfather. What made her story different was the unexpected validation she had received and the platform it had provided to encourage others. Every military family has stories of sacrifice and service that deserve to be preserved and honored, she would tell her audiences. The challenge is finding the right way to ensure those stories are never forgotten, whether through artwork, writing, photography, or simply making sure the stories are passed down through the generations. The Texas A&M audience listened intently as Sarah shared the lessons she had learned from her grandfather and from the journey that began with criticism of her tattoo and led to national recognition of his heroism. "My grandfather never sought recognition for his actions during World War II," Sarah told the crowd of students, faculty, and veterans. Like so many members of his generation, he was modest about his service and focused on the sacrifices of the men who didn't make it home. But he taught me that honoring those sacrifices is one of the most important responsibilities we can accept. She paused to look out at the audience, which included many young people who might be facing their own decisions about how to honor family military heritage. "When I decided to get my memorial tattoo, I wasn't thinking about other people's opinions or reactions. I was thinking about making sure my grandfather's memory and the memory of his fallen comrades would be preserved permanently. I wanted to carry their stories with me wherever I went for the rest of my life." Sarah explained how the initial criticism had been painful, but had ultimately led to the most meaningful validation possible when Commander Sullivan and his fellow veterans recognized the true significance of her tribute. "The lesson I learned is that doing the right thing isn't always immediately understood or appreciated by others," she continued. "But if your motives are pure and your actions are meaningful, the truth will eventually be recognized. My grandfather always told me that integrity means doing the right thing even when no one is watching, and especially when people are criticizing you for it." The speech concluded with Sarah's challenge to the audience to think about their own family military connections and consider how they might preserve and honor those legacies. "Each of you has the opportunity to be a keeper of memory, a preserver of sacrifice, and a bridge between the generation that served and the generations that will benefit from their service. The specific way you choose to honor that legacy is less important than the commitment to ensure it's never forgotten." After the speech, Sarah was approached by dozens of audience members who wanted to share their own family military stories or ask for advice about memorial projects. And in addition to advancing that generous customs, the book was not product. One young woman showed her a design for a tattoo honoring her Marine Corps father, while a graduate student explained his research project documenting Korean War veterans from his hometown. These conversations reminded Sarah why her work had become so important to her. Each person who was inspired to preserve military history or honor veteran sacrifice created a multiplying effect that ensured more stories would be preserved and more sacrifices would be remembered. Later that evening, as Sarah drove home through the Texas countryside, she thought about how much her life had changed since that morning at the diner 2 years earlier. The young woman who had once hidden her tattoo under long sleeves was now proud to display it as a symbol of military family dedication and historical preservation. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Commander Sullivan, who had watched her speech online from his home in Virginia. "Outstanding presentation as always," his message read. "Your grandfather would be incredibly proud of how you've carried forward his legacy and inspired others to honor their own military heroes. Semper Fi to the memory of Sergeant Martinez and all who served with him." Sarah smiled as she read the message, feeling the deep satisfaction that came from knowing she had honored her grandfather's memory in exactly the way he would have wanted. The criticism and judgment she had once faced seemed like a distant memory, replaced by the knowledge that Miguel Martinez's story was now preserved for future generations and that his example of courage and sacrifice would continue to inspire others. As she pulled into her driveway, Sarah looked up at the stars and whispered a quiet thank you to her grandfather. The tattoo on her arm was no longer just a personal memorial. It had become a symbol of military family pride, a reminder that sacrifice should be honored, and proof that the truth about honor and respect will always prevail over ignorance and prejudice. The story that began with laughter and criticism had evolved into a legacy of recognition and inspiration, ensuring that Sergeant Miguel Martinez and the Marines who served with him would never be forgotten, and that their sacrifice would continue to inspire new generations of Americans to understand and appreciate the price of freedom. Sarah's journey had proven that sometimes the most meaningful acts of respect and remembrance come not from grand ceremonies or official recognition, but from the quiet, permanent commitment of a granddaughter who loved her grandfather enough to carry his memory and the memory of his fallen comrades with her for the rest of her life. The tattoo that had once been mocked was now celebrated. The young woman who had been criticized was now honored, and the grandfather's story that had been nearly forgotten was now preserved forever, inspiring others to ensure that the sacrifices of all veterans would be remembered and respected by future generations.